You know that walk, the one where you're heading to get the mail or walking the dog, and you pass your neighbor's front yard, and you slow down without meaning to. Their flowers look like something out of a magazine, full, colorful, layered, alive. And you stand there for a second, thinking the same thought you've thought a dozen times before. Why does their garden always look better than mine? You water your flowers. You picked pretty varieties. You even read up on sunlight and soil. And yet somehow, when you step back and look at your own flower bed, something feels a little flat, a little plain, a little unfinished. Here's the good news. It is not because they spent more money. It is not because they got lucky with better weather. And it is definitely not because they have some secret fertilizer you don't know about. The truth is quieter than that, and honestly, a lot more interesting. Beautiful gardens leave clues. Small, almost invisible decisions that most people walk right past without ever noticing them. Today we're going to slow down and actually look for those clues, one at a time, until the whole picture makes sense. By the end of this video, you're going to look at your neighbor's garden completely differently. And more importantly, you're going to look at your own garden differently too. Here's something worth sitting with for a second. Nobody wakes up with a breathtaking garden. Not your neighbor, not the accounts you scroll through online, not the gardens you see in magazines. Every single one of them started as bare dirt, a few small plants, and a lot of trial and error. So if beautiful gardens aren't accidents, and they aren't about luck or money, what actually separates an average flower bed from one that stops people in their tracks? It comes down to a set of habits. Quiet, almost boring habits that have nothing to do with which flowers you buy, and everything to do with how you think about your garden as a whole. Most gardening advice focuses on the plants themselves. Today, we're looking past the flowers, at the decisions happening underneath them. But before we get into all of that, if you are new here, welcome. This channel is all about practical, no-nonsense gardening advice that actually helps you grow a garden you are proud of. If you enjoy this kind of content, please take just 2 seconds and hit that like button down below. It genuinely helps more people find this video, and it really means a lot to me. And if you want to see more videos like this, tips on planting, garden design, what to grow season by season, make sure you subscribe and tap the little bell icon so you get notified every single time I post. We are building a really wonderful community of gardeners here, and I would love to have you as part of it. Now, there are 10 of these hidden reasons. Some of them will feel obvious once you hear them. Others might genuinely surprise you. But once you see all 10 together, you'll understand why some gardens feel effortless, and why others, no matter how much love goes into them, still feel like something is missing. Let's start with the very first thing that separates the two. Reason 1. They design before they plant. Picture this. You're at the garden center on a Saturday morning. Something catches your eye. A pot of deep purple salvia, maybe, or a tray of cheerful zinnias. You grab it. 10 minutes later, you've grabbed 4 more things, and none of them were planned. You get home, dig a few holes, and hope for the best. Most of us have done exactly this. It's not a mistake exactly, it's just reactive. And reactive gardens tend to look like exactly what they are, a collection of individual purchases rather than one cohesive picture. Here's what surprised me most when I started paying attention to the gardens that actually stop people on the sidewalk. Almost none of them were planted impulsively. Before a single seed went into the ground, someone stood in that space and asked a few simple questions. How tall will this get? What will be blooming in June versus September? What color is next to what? Where does the eye land first? That's it. That's design. It doesn't require a landscaping degree or fancy software. It can be a rough sketch on the back of a receipt, or just 15 minutes of standing in your yard imagining the finished picture before you touch a shovel. The mini takeaway here is simple. Buying flowers is not the same as designing a flower bed. One is shopping, the other is storytelling. And every breathtaking garden you've ever admired was telling a story before it ever bloomed. But knowing what to plant is only half of it. The next hidden reason is about how those plants are actually arranged in the ground, and it changes everything. Reason 2, they plant in groups, not singles. Here's a strange thing about the human eye. A single flower, no matter how gorgeous, tends to read as a dot, a small, lonely accent that gets swallowed by everything around it. But that same flower, repeated 5 or 7 times in a cluster, suddenly reads as a bold, confident statement. This is one of those flower gardening tips that almost nobody talks about, and it might be the single fastest way to make an average bed look intentional. Most beginner gardens, understandably, are planted one of each. One coneflower here, one daylily there, one hosta by the fence. It feels varied and exciting when you're shopping, but once it's in the ground, it often looks scattered and busy instead of full. Professional garden designers almost never plant single specimens, except for very deliberate focal points like a small tree or a striking shrub. Everything else tends to be grouped in odd numbers, 3s, 5s, 7s, planted close enough together that they visually blend into one shape instead of standing apart as separate little islands. Try this the next time you're planning a bed. Instead of buying 6 different varieties, one of each, buy 3 varieties and get several of each one. You'll actually spend less on variety, and the bed will look dramatically more finished. That single shift, from collecting to clustering, is often the exact reason a garden goes from looking like a hobby to looking like a destination. And once your groups are in place, the next question becomes just as important. What happens after they're done blooming? Reason 3. They plan for blooms through every season. Most gardeners don't realize this until they've been gardening for a few years, sometimes longer. There's a very specific, very common pattern. Spring arrives, everything looks incredible for about 6 glorious weeks, and then by midsummer, the bed goes quiet. A few stragglers here and there, mostly green, mostly done. Meanwhile, that one garden you keep admiring seems to have something happening in it constantly, from the first crocus in March all the way through the last aster in October. This is not luck. This is sequencing. Experienced gardeners think of their beds almost like a relay race, where one plant's peak bloom time hands off to the next plant's peak bloom time, so there's rarely a moment where the whole bed goes flat at once. This is one of the biggest differences between a beginner flower bed and a genuinely beautiful one, and it directly answers a question a lot of people search for, which is why flowers don't bloom the way they expect them to, season after season. Often, it isn't a health problem with the plant at all. It's simply that the entire bed was planted with things that all peak in the same narrow window, so once that window closes, there's nothing left to catch the eye. The fix is refreshingly simple. When you're choosing perennial flowers for a bed, deliberately pick a mix of early, mid, and late-season bloomers, a few spring bulbs, some early summer perennials, a couple of late-season showstoppers like sedum or asters. You're not just picking pretty flowers anymore, you're building a calendar. And that calendar is exactly what makes a garden feel alive year-round, instead of spectacular for 6 weeks, and forgettable for the other 46. But blooms are only part of the picture. There's another hidden reason that has almost nothing to do with flowers at all, and it might be the most overlooked one on this entire list. Reason 4. They value foliage as much as flowers. Here's a question worth asking yourself honestly. When you picture a beautiful garden, do you only picture flowers? Because if so, you're missing at least half of what's actually creating that beauty. Walk past a genuinely stunning flower bed and take away the blooms in your mind for a second. What's left? Chances are you'll still see something gorgeous. Silvery lamb's ear leaves, deep burgundy heuchera, the bold, tropical-looking leaves of a hosta, feathery ferns tucked into the shade. Foliage is the unsung hero of healthy flowers and beautiful gardens everywhere, and most beginners walk right past it at the garden center because it doesn't have the instant visual reward of a bloom. But foliage is what carries a garden through the moments when nothing is flowering. It provides texture, contrast, and a sense of fullness that flowers alone simply cannot sustain on their own. Think about texture the way you'd think about fabric in an outfit. Smooth, glossy leaves next to something feathery and fine, next to something broad and bold, creates visual interest even in a completely monochromatic bed of greens. That's why some gardens look rich and layered even in a photo taken in the middle of a slow bloom week, while others look sparse no matter how many flowers are technically present. The mini takeaway is this: start choosing plants not just for their flower color, but for their leaf shape, size, and texture too. Once you start seeing foliage as a design tool instead of a background detail, you'll never look at a garden center the same way again. Foliage gives a garden its bones, but there's a bigger structural idea sitting underneath that, and it's the next thing we need to talk about. Reason 5. They repeat colors instead of collecting random plants. This one quietly explains why some gardens feel calm and intentional, while others, despite having gorgeous individual flowers, feel a little chaotic. It's incredibly tempting, especially as a beginner, to fall in love with every pretty color you see. A hot pink here, a bright orange there, a splash of purple, some yellow for contrast. Each flower on its own is lovely, but scattered randomly across a bed, all those competing colors start to visually cancel each other out, and the eye doesn't know where to settle. The gardens that stop people on the sidewalk almost always have a repeating color thread running through them. Maybe it's soft purples and whites, echoed in 3 or 4 different spots across the bed. Maybe it's warm oranges and deep reds that show up again and again in different plants and different textures. The specific palette matters far less than the repetition itself. This is one of those garden design ideas that costs absolutely nothing to apply, and it works in any style, from a cottage garden to a sleek, modern landscaping bed. Before your next trip to the nursery, try picking 2 or 3 colors you genuinely love, and commit to weaving those same colors throughout the whole space, instead of grabbing whatever catches your eye that day. Repetition is what turns a collection of flowers into a designed space. And once color is repeating throughout a bed, the next thing that separates good from breathtaking is something most people never even think to look at, which is depth. Reason 6. They build layers and depth. Most flower beds, especially beginner ones, are essentially flat. Everything is roughly the same height, planted in a single visual plane, so from a distance the whole thing reads as one uniform blob of color. But here's where it gets interesting. The gardens that feel truly immersive, the ones that almost seem to pull you in, are built in layers, much like a forest is layered, from tall elements in the back down to low, spilling plants at the very front edge. Think of it in 3 simple tiers. Tall plants like ornamental grasses, delphiniums, or small shrubs anchor the back. Mid-height perennials fill the middle, doing most of the visual heavy lifting, and low trailing plants soften the very front edge, spilling slightly over a border or pathway. This layering does 2 things at once. It creates actual depth, so your eye travels through the bed instead of just landing flat on the surface. And it also hides the awkward, bare stems that almost every plant has near its base, since the layer in front quietly covers it. If your flower bed has ever felt strangely flat despite having gorgeous individual plants, this is very often the missing piece. Try grouping your existing plants by height in your mind, tall, medium, low, and see if there's an obvious gap in one of those tiers. Filling that single gap can transform the entire bed almost overnight. Depth pulls the eye in, but the next hidden reason is almost the opposite instinct, and it might be the hardest one for a lot of gardeners to actually accept. Reason 7. They aren't afraid of empty space. This might be the most counterintuitive thing on this entire list, so stick with me here. When you're standing in front of a brand new flower bed, empty soil feels uncomfortable. It feels unfinished, almost embarrassing, like everyone walking by can see exactly how new and bare it is. So the instinct is to fill every single inch, cramming plants close together so there's no visible dirt left anywhere. The problem is, that instinct almost always backfires within a year or two. Plants grow. What looked perfectly spaced on planting day turns into a crowded, competing mess by the following summer, with everything fighting for light, air, and root space. Overcrowded plants are also far more prone to disease, since airflow gets choked off between the leaves. Experienced gardeners have learned to tolerate that uncomfortable, slightly bare look in the first season because they're planting for what the bed will look like in 3 years, not in 3 weeks. They leave breathing room. They accept a little visible mulch or soil early on, trusting that the plants will fill in exactly as intended. This single mindset shift solves 2 problems at once. It prevents the overcrowding that leads to weak, disease-prone plants down the road, and it actually creates a more polished look long-term, because plants given proper space develop fuller, more natural shapes instead of stretching awkwardly toward whatever light they can find. So the next time you're planting, and it feels like there's too much space between everything, that discomfort is usually a sign you're doing it right, not wrong. Empty space takes patience, and that theme of patience leads directly into one of the most important habits on this entire list. Reason 8. They constantly edit and improve. Here's something almost nobody tells beginners, and it might be the biggest myth about gardening altogether. A beautiful flower bed is never actually finished. The gardens you admire most were not planted once, perfectly, and then left alone forever. They were edited, constantly, quietly, season after season. A plant that didn't thrive got moved or removed. A gap that appeared got filled with something new. A combination that didn't quite work visually got rearranged the following spring. This is one of the biggest gardening mistakes beginners make without even realizing it, treating the initial planting as the final version instead of the first draft. When something isn't working, whether that's a color clash, a plant that's clearly unhappy in its spot, or a section that looks weirdly empty, experienced gardeners don't just accept it and move on. They treat their garden the way a writer treats a manuscript, going back through it again and again, making small adjustments that add up to something much better over time. This willingness to edit is also exactly why some gardens keep improving every single year, while others plateau or even decline. Nature isn't static, so a garden that isn't actively tended and adjusted tends to drift toward chaos rather than beauty on its own. The mini takeaway here is genuinely freeing. If something in your garden isn't working, you're allowed to change it. In fact, changing it is exactly what the gardeners you admire are quietly doing behind the scenes, every single season. And that idea of ongoing change connects directly to the next hidden reason, which might be the one that finally puts your own progress into perspective. Reason 9. They don't compare this year's garden to last year's triumphs. There's a quiet trap that even experienced gardeners fall into. You have one incredible season, everything blooms perfectly, the timing lines up, the weather cooperates, and then the following year, for reasons that might have nothing to do with anything you did wrong, it just isn't quite as spectacular. It's tempting to see that as failure, as backsliding, as proof that you somehow got worse at gardening. But gardens are living systems, shaped by weather, soil changes, plant maturity, even which pests happen to show up that particular year. A slightly quieter season isn't a step backward, it's simply the nature of working with something alive instead of something manufactured. The gardeners whose beds keep improving over the long run are the ones who've made peace with this ebb and flow, rather than getting discouraged by a single underwhelming year and giving up entirely. This matters because so much of gardening for beginners, and honestly gardening at any level, comes down to sticking with it long enough to learn what your specific space actually needs. That knowledge only comes from paying attention across multiple seasons, not from getting everything right on the very first try. So if this year's flower bed doesn't quite match last year's, that's not a verdict on your abilities. It's simply one data point in a much longer, much more interesting story that's still being written. And that idea of a longer story leads us straight into the final, and honestly the most important, reason on this entire list. Reason 10. You're comparing your beginning to someone else's years. Here's the truth that ties every single thing on this list together, and it's the one I most wanted you to walk away with today. That neighbor whose flower bed stopped you in your tracks. The one that started this whole conversation. Their garden did not look like that in its first season. It almost certainly didn't look like that in its second or third season either. What you're looking at is the accumulated result of years of small decisions, quiet edits, a few failed experiments nobody ever mentions, and a whole lot of simply paying attention over time. When you compare your brand new flower bed, planted this spring, to a garden that's had 5 or 10 years to mature, layer, and get edited into its current form, you're not comparing two gardens fairly. You're comparing your very beginning to someone else's long middle chapter. This is, without question, one of the most common and most unnecessary sources of discouragement for anyone gardening for beginners, and honestly for a lot of intermediate gardeners too. It has nothing to do with skill, and everything to do with timeline. Every single one of the 9 reasons we just walked through, the design, the grouping, the seasonal planning, the foliage, the color repetition, the layers, the patience with empty space, the constant editing, the acceptance of quieter years, all of it takes time to build. Not because you're doing anything wrong right now, but because gardens, real ones, are grown, not assembled. So the next time you walk past a garden that stops you in your tracks, I hope you see it a little differently now. Not as proof that you're falling short, but as a kind of quiet roadmap, a set of small, learnable decisions stacked on top of each other, one season at a time. Beautiful gardens are never created overnight. They're created through patience, through observation, through the willingness to try something, watch what happens, and adjust. That's true whether you're growing your very first flower bed this year or you've been gardening for decades. There is always another season, another chance to design a little more thoughtfully, group a little more intentionally, and edit a little more honestly. So instead of comparing your garden to your neighbor's, try comparing it to your own garden last year. Look for the small wins, the bed that filled in a little more, the color combination that finally worked, the plant that finally thrived in the right spot. That's the comparison that actually matters, and it's the one that will keep you motivated for every season ahead. If this video helped you see your own garden a little differently, I would love for you to give it a like and subscribe for more gardening tips and flower garden inspiration like this. And I'm genuinely curious, so let me know in the comments which of these 10 hidden reasons surprised you the most, or tell me what you think is the real secret behind a truly beautiful flower garden. I read every single comment, and I can't wait to see what you have to say. Until next time, happy gardening, and I'll see you in the next video.